Finally, some positive news for Ukraine from United States President Donald Trump. For the first time during his current term, Trump will send weapons to Ukraine based on emergency presidential powers, which, oddly enough, allow the head of the American state to take weapons from Pentagon stockpiles and send them to help allies in emergency situations. And this comes after Pentagon Chief Pete Hegseth suspended arms deliveries to Ukraine, supposedly because the Pentagon's stockpiles were almost depleted. In addition, Trump stated that he had reached an agreement with European NATO countries to sell them American weapons, and they would then transfer those weapons to Ukraine. Moreover, we're talking about almost the entire range of weapons, both defensive and offensive. But don't let this scheme of supplying weapons from the Americans through NATO scare you. That's exactly what was agreed upon at the summit in The Hague last month, when it was about including military aid to Ukraine in the defense budgets of the North Atlantic Alliance countries. My name is Alexei Pechi. Today is July 11th. In this episode, we'll take a detailed look at all these schemes of Donald Trump and how he is now increasing military, let me emphasize, military aid to Ukraine. But before we begin, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, write any comment you want, and be sure to subscribe to my Telegram channel, Peachy News. The link to it is in the description of this video. There we publish breaking news as it comes in. So, United States President Donald Trump, for the first time during his current presidential term, will send weapons to Ukraine based on emergency presidential powers. These powers allow Trump to simply take weapons from the stockpiles of the Pentagon or the United States Department of Defense and use these weapons to help allies in emergency situations. Essentially, this is the very program through which Joe Biden often provided emergency military aid to Ukraine, bypassing the United States Congress. Because to exercise presidential powers in this matter, he doesn't need to coordinate this aid with anyone. Sources in the White House notably emphasized that this mechanism was often used by Donald Trump's predecessor, Joe Biden, who was a staunch supporter of Ukraine. They say this is symbolic, since Trump often criticized Biden for this, but in the end, he himself resorted to exactly this mechanism. And importantly, this is not the sale of weapons, this is specifically free, gratuitous military aid. It is noted that the aid allocated by Trump could amount to about $300 million. The package may include Patriot defensive missiles and medium-range offensive missiles. The weapons could be on the front lines in Ukraine within a few days, as these supplies are located in Europe, particularly in Poland. Before that, the Trump administration only sent weapons that had been allocated during Joe Biden's time. And now, the agency believes that the supply of weapons by Trump's decision may indicate a change in his policy toward Ukraine, about the new interest of the American leader in the defense of our country. Let me remind you that earlier, United States Secretary of State Marco Rubio stated that the pause in supplying weapons to Ukraine is not a political issue, but purely a technical one related to the need to check American arsenals. Let me remind you that in previous episodes, we provided information from the relevant committees of the United States Congress, who said that, in fact, the Pentagon's weapon stockpiles are fine, and there have been no emergency funding requests from Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. Accordingly, this indicates that there is more than enough weaponry. But even then, everything is still with Pete Hegseth. His team assured that, well, we suspended military aid because there were signs that there wasn't enough weaponry for ourselves. And then suddenly Trump signs a military aid package for $300 million, which actually involves taking weapons from those very Pentagon stockpiles that, according to Pete Hegseth, are supposedly almost depleted. But as it turned out, this was only the first step in Trump increasing aid to Ukraine. According to the television channel, United States President Donald Trump agreed with NATO that the states would send weapons to Ukraine through the alliance, and NATO would pay 100% for these weapons. Next, I will quote Donald Trump. "We are sending weapons to NATO, and NATO is paying 100% for these weapons. We will send Patriot systems to NATO, and then NATO will distribute them." Well, besides that, Trump announced that on Monday, July 14th, he will make some very important statement about Russia, but he hasn't provided any details yet. As he stated, "I'm disappointed with Russia. On Monday, I will make a critical statement about Russia." It's interesting that this message from Donald Trump was read out by the host. But you shouldn't be confused by this, because for Trump, it's quite a normal practice to send a message to his favorite journalist before making an important public statement, so that when they announce it, it stirs up the public. It's important to note here that Donald Trump, who promised a quick end to Russia's war against Ukraine, for a long time showed a conciliatory tone toward Moscow, moving away from the policy of strong support for Kyiv. But recently, after he approved providing defensive weapons to Ukraine, the United States president made an unusually direct criticism of the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin, saying that the Kremlin leader's statements about moving toward peace are actually meaningless. And Trump is also considering supporting a bill that is currently in the Senate, which provides for tough anti-Russian sanctions, including 500% tariffs for countries that buy oil, gas, uranium, and other goods from Russia. And now, as the publication reports today, United States President Donald Trump may sell NATO allies weapons for Ukraine that are not only defensive but also offensive in nature. The corresponding plan was proposed at the last NATO summit in The Hague. It was discussed with representatives of Ukraine and allies from Europe, and now Europe absolutely agrees with this plan. Moreover, they also benefit from this situation. I'll explain why a bit later. And one of the European speakers confirmed this kind of discussion, but he noted that his government supposedly doesn't know anything yet about the final agreements. Although, let me remind you, Chancellor of Germany Friedrich Merz has been talking about this scheme for a long time already. Plus, Norway is also talking about it. They are ready, for example, to simply spend money on 3 Patriot batteries, which they are ready to buy from the Americans, and then transfer them to Ukraine and give them, to Ukraine. And here Trump is using a trick that actually won't hurt us at all. On the contrary, we will benefit greatly from it. In this situation, it appears that everyone benefits except for Moscow. As one of the White House officials stated, quote, "The President, the United States supplies defensive weapons to NATO. NATO can decide what to do with them next, but the United States itself is not supplying weapons to Ukraine." And let me explain a bit here. At the NATO summit in The Hague last month, all alliance members agreed on the defense spending of NATO member countries. By the year 2035, they should be brought up to the level of 5% of their gross domestic product. The final document of the summit states that from now on, NATO member countries will have to allocate 3.5% of their gross domestic product for traditional defense needs. And another 1.5% of gross domestic product is planned to be invested in the fight against terrorism and in the development of infrastructure that can be used for military purposes, for example, bridges capable of supporting tanks, railways, ports, and so on. That is, things that can be used both for civilian and military purposes. At the moment, NATO members are required to spend 2% of their gross domestic product on defense. And the need to increase these expenditures is explained by the growing threat from Russia, which has been waging a full-scale war against Ukraine since 2022, as well as by the demand of United States President Donald Trump to shift the main responsibility for the defense of Europe onto the Europeans themselves. But for Ukraine, something else is important in this context. As it turned out, all NATO countries agreed to include 0.25% of their gross domestic product in their own defense expenditures for Ukraine's needs, military needs. That is, purchasing weapons for Ukraine will be considered defense spending within the framework of the North Atlantic Alliance. And here Trump came up with a clever move. The United States will sell weapons to Europe for at least that very 0.25% of their gross domestic product, and then European countries will transfer those weapons to Ukraine. So it turns out that the United States is not formally supplying weapons to Ukraine, which reassures the radical supporters of Trump who are against supporting Ukraine. Trump can now confidently say, "I'm just selling American weapons to Europe, nothing more." And Europe, within its own security architecture, decides where to send these weapons next. And what happens to it next is no longer America's business, it's up to the Europeans. Trump can use this same argument in his dialogue with the Russians, which he obviously isn't giving up on. But in reality, the United States is sending weapons into Ukraine through European NATO members acting as intermediaries. For now, Trump has also focused on another way to put pressure on Russia. This is the Graham-Blumenthal sanctions bill. However, one of the White House sources noted that the president will not sign it unless it gives 100% flexibility for imposing and lifting sanctions at the personal discretion of Donald Trump. However, the Senate has already allowed Trump the option to delay sanctions for up to 180 days there. In general, the President of the United States has the specific right to decide whether to impose or lift sanctions against Russia and its allies. Overall, things are progressing, which is encouraging, so for now I remain optimistic. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like.